So I'll start here on page 6 with implementation issues for legislative consideration, and I'll be discussing both proposals, ACA 4 as well as the governor's proposal. Both of these proposals introduce new formulas into the state's budget process. Our budget process is already highly complex. To discuss formulas for a moment. On March 25th this year, we will learn what the preliminary estimate of personal income is for the fourth quarter of 2013. That is a vital input to the Proposition 98 calculation for the next budget year, 14-15. Now, the situation where it appears we're at right now tells us this, that if that calculation of personal income is weaker than we're now expecting, schools may be in line to get more money next year. If it's stronger than we're expecting, schools may be in line to get less money next year. The problem with formulas and putting them into the Constitution, or at least a big challenge, is that you cannot anticipate all of the different variables that could affect how those formulas will interact with the other decisions you have to make each year. And that's something that the legislature should consider very carefully. With regard to ACA 4, as we've discussed previously, its regression model could be very difficult to administer. One of the things to keep in mind is that if you decide to leave ACA 4 on the ballot, you may want to think this year about appropriating funds to the Franchise Tax Board. They're going to need to develop a lot of the key information that we would need to have reliable data about that model. But even then, going back 20 years and thinking about tax changes that were made, those are going to be very difficult things to estimate. And they're going to be prone to some subjective judgments that could affect the outcome of the model. When you're dealing with regression lines, the judgments about the difference between one number and the next can affect the slope of the regression line. And so if you go in and you have to make subjective judgments about changes that happened 15 or 17 years ago, a decision to have one growth factor of 5% that year versus 3.5% could make a material difference in the amount of reserves that you might have to set aside this year, 20 years later. With regard to the governor's measure, capital gains is something that's also very difficult to forecast, and the governor has made that point quite forcefully, and we agree with him. Now, our budget is such that when you craft a budget, you have to have some assumption about capital gains in the stock market. It's simply too big a part of our revenue system not to. But as Ryan was pointing out, in a good year, capital gains are 10% of our revenues. Under the governor's proposal, capital gains would drive essentially all of your decisions about the reserve. This element that's quite difficult to forecast and that can change a lot between when you forecast it and when you know what the actual totals were 2 or 3 years later. The chair is fond of talking about how the budget of the state involves simple math, addition, and subtraction. It's more complicated than that, of course. And it seems like in recent years it's become more like advanced algebra or physics. We're moving really toward a time when the budget becomes more like advanced physics or quantum physics. We have a lot of things still moving for 2 or 3 years ago now, more than ever before, even as you try to set next year's budget. And what the governor's proposal would do with its true-up mechanism, which it kind of has to have because we don't know what capital gains really are until a couple of years later, it means that you have even more things that would be moving in the past at the same time that you're trying to set the budget for the future. Now, in 2005-06, for instance, compared to the first estimates of capital gains that the administration had in the May revision, the eventual totals for what capital gains actually were substantially higher. So that means, and it's not completely a fair comparison because the governor's measure wasn't in place yet, we had a big structural deficit. But a couple of years later, in the 2007-08 budget process, you would have had, if the governor's measure had been in place, you would have had to set aside more reserves in June 2007 or whenever the budget was passed that year. And at the same time that in 2007-08, if you recall, we were beginning to make some substantial cuts to programs. Now, as I mentioned, it's not completely a fair comparison because I think the idea of the governor's proposal is if it had been in place before then, ideally you would have been less likely to be in a structural deficit situation in the first place. But a couple of years later can be a long time, and you can have a lot of changes. And I think it's definitely true that under the governor's measure, you could be in a situation where you're having to, unless it's suspended or reduced in some way, having to make reserve deposits even as you're contemplating restraint or cuts in other programs a couple of years later. 6.5%, the threshold chosen, it is a below average year. In fact, if you go back to the mid-90s and you capture two bubbles in the investment markets, late 90s, mid-2000s, and two downturns, the average is actually more like 7.5% per year. And I think that the bottom line is there isn't a clear right number to set for that. We discussed earlier the potential changes that a change in federal tax law could have in capital gains, but also just changes in the economy for how prevalent and how large capital gains are could affect this in the future. So we don't know what an average year would be in the future. And so that's one thing to consider when putting the number in the Constitution. On to page 7, both of these measures use funds for purposes other than building reserves, and these are laudable goals. Infrastructure spending or paying down debt for ACA 4 principally, as well as some other potential uses. And in the governor's proposal to pay down the wall of debt, to have funding for infrastructure in lieu of authorized bonds or extra pension and retiree health payments. One of the things that we would mention, while all of those things are good, in our judgment, and as we've thought about reserve mechanisms over the last few years, it gets pretty difficult when you're building a reserve mechanism, which is hard enough, to build in some of these other things. For example, when we get the text of the governor's measure, you will want to think about, well, if they allow payments to pension funds, extra payments to pension unfunded liabilities in lieu of a reserve payment, does that interact at all with the funding plan for CalSTRS that you all are going to be asked to adopt in all likelihood this year or next year? That's something to consider. With regard to Proposition 98, we've discussed it quite a bit. These things don't necessarily work in ways that you expect. I mean, Mr. Schweitzer was mentioning before how test 3 years would tend to be the years where you wouldn't set aside money in reserves. And I'm not sure if he was talking about the Proposition 98 reserve or the BSA. Well, this year, 13-14, is a test 3 year. And by the Department of Finance's estimates, capital gains will be about a little under 10% of general fund revenues. So this is a year where, if the measure were in place, potentially there would be reserve deposits. On to page 8, and I'll talk for a few minutes about the issues of legislative power versus the power of the governor. I think this committee is well aware of something that we discuss often, that the power of the purse is perhaps the most significant power of the legislature. Now, by their design, these reserve mechanisms are designed to constrain the legislature's spending power. That's their intent. And I think that we're not saying that's altogether a bad thing. If you want to ensure that the state sets aside money in good times and put that in the Constitution, you're necessarily going to be constraining the legislature's power to spend. And that's really the big issue that you have to consider when looking at these proposals. To what extent and in what circumstances do you feel comfortable with having the legislature's power so constrained? On to the next page. As we understand the administration's proposal, under the governor's proposal, the governor would have to declare a fiscal emergency and ask for the legislature to transfer the rainy day reserve funds, the main rainy day reserve, to the general fund before such a transfer would occur. The Proposition 98 reserve, as we understand it, would work kind of automatically, just to make sure that Proposition 98 gets the funds that it is intended to get under the measure. ACA 4 delegates various formula calculations to the executive branch, and while we understand that the key calculations would be in the Budget Act, in the governor's proposal, meaning the legislature would have input into them, these complex formulas inevitably would require a lot of detailed expertise by both executive branch staff and legislative staff. I think in terms of thinking about these proposals, one of the things that we observe is that a lot of these proposals over the years seem to assume that the data necessary to run a formula is knowable with some objective certainty, that it's not subject to interpretation. And as your fiscal advisors, we want to tell you that that's just not so. These formulas all require interpretation. They all require subjectivity. And while you might feel comfortable with the current administration, and we have the greatest respect for the Department of Finance, putting this in the Constitution means that in the future, a legislature may be debating a budget with a governor who is insistent that his calculations of the formula are the right ones. And the debate will become about, well, is the formula calculated correctly? Do the numbers on the spreadsheets add up? Well, the numbers on the spreadsheets are themselves prone to a lot of human judgment, particularly when you get into the area of capital gains. And so I guess before turning it back to Mr. Miller, that would be really our big picture comment. Think about these formulas. And there are a lot of merits of adding a formula like these to the Constitution to help improve the state's poor track record in the past of building reserves. But these are all cautions that we give you. And Mr. Miller will talk about, elaborate a bit more on some ideas that we put forward related to Proposition 58.
Thank you, Mr. Sisney. Mr. Miller.
Thank you. So ideally, we wouldn't necessarily need a formula. And I think that this year is evidence that the Prop 58 mechanism could work. We're experiencing projected healthy growth in 14-15 in revenues, and the governor has proposed setting aside funds in the BSA. This year, half of that has to go to the ERBs, the economic recovery bonds, as per Proposition 58. But after that, we would be assuming a 3% deposit each year. We could very quickly build to the existing maximum of Proposition 58, $8 billion. That said, as we referenced earlier, the state has had a poor track record in setting aside funds, and so we understand why we're having the conversation. In our January overview, we presented some alternative ideas. For example, you could expand the size of the rainy day reserve, just like ACA 4 and the governor's measure proposes to do. You could restrict the frequency at which the governor and legislature could suspend and reduce the amount of the transfer to a specified number of years in every rolling decade. Similarly, you could restrict the frequency of withdrawals in the same way. Finally, another idea that we had was that you could move the deadline for the rainy day fund decision from June 1st, which is presently before the Budget Act is passed, to July 1st to ensure that the rainy day fund determination is consistent with the Budget Act. And so with that, we'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Many questions come to mind. With regard to some of the bigger, broader issues before us, and Mr. Sisney, you're underscoring that all of these formulas do restrict, by design, our ability to make determinations. And it's especially difficult where we find ourselves now because we're just coming out of a period where we have cut so much of our public infrastructure. We know that from your own projections, if we hadn't seen the crash of '08, we would probably have a general fund of about $130 billion right now, whereas we're at about 106. We would have been as low as $87 billion without $88 billion without the benefits of Prop 30 just a couple years ago. So that's a good quarter of all of our revenue just dissipated, gone, up in smoke. And so now we're talking about putting billions aside, as the governor's proposed, even in the current budget proposal, and we're looking to see if we might build on Prop 58, which I think is somewhat euphemistic in making it more restrictive, serving more of a purpose of a reserve. And it's difficult because we have so many aspects of state governmental operations coming to us to make the case that they can't survive on current level funding. And even with the additional revenue, we're still 30% below the national average in our per pupil spending, even at $8,300 per year, which is certainly an improvement over the $7,000 we were at. But with a national average of over $11,000, how many billions do we want to put aside? Imagine having $8 billion in reserve and we're still 30% below national average in per pupil spending. Don't our kids need it, and don't they need it now? 3, 4, 5 years from now, it's not going to do them much good. They're not going to be able to compete. We've got a judiciary system that many would suggest is on life support right now. We're closing courtrooms, we're closing courthouses. How can we continue to let that be the status quo when we're talking about putting $3, $4 to $8 billion into reserves? And at the same time, maybe some of these things wouldn't have happened if we had been a little more prudent looking back a few years. So they're all really tough questions for us. In the broadest sense, first of all, do you think that the governor's current proposal is really building on Prop 58? I think that's how it's been described. Or is it really reinventing or tossing it out and starting pretty much from scratch?
I think it's pretty much starting from scratch. So I think that, replacing the mechanism, the state does not have to deposit 3% per year under Proposition 58. The governor has the ability not just to suspend that, but to reduce it to less than 3%. But I think that moving it to something that's a capital gains-driven mechanism with 2 years of true-ups and a separate Prop 58 reserve is quite different. In addition, it grows the size of the reserve. The budget stabilization account, as we understand the governor's proposal, would fill up to 10% of general fund taxes, and then separately there would be the Proposition 98 reserve, which could grow to 10% of the minimum guarantee, which is about 6% of general fund taxes. So a 10% budget stabilization account, as well as a Prop 98 reserve that could grow to 6% of revenue. So those are quite different. And I think that as we said before, this is a very healthy debate. The challenge with thinking about this issue in the present moment is that state finances are doing very well right now. And we know from history that that could change very quickly. And it's quite possible that we'll look back in a few years and think this was the peak of this economic expansion. And so the challenge is not just thinking about the programs that were affected by the cuts of recent years, but also about how to sustain them through the next downturn.
You had briefly touched on a question that I asked Mr. Schweitzer a little earlier about the differences in Test 1, 2, 3 relative to the Prop 98 proposal. And then you pointed out that we could have and I, after hearing his response, said, well, it sounds as if the two actually could work in concert, in harmony. But you then raised the possibility of the current year where we're in Test 3, which would mean a lowering of revenue, but at the same time, we're seeing after the fact revenues going up. You want to get into that a little bit?
Well, I think it was just the point. We are in a Test 3 year, and under the Department of Finance's projections in the January budget, capital gains are around 10% of revenues this year, above the 6.5% threshold. So I think that while in concept, Test 3 years might be the years when, when we wouldn't be depositing money to reserve, it's not going to work like that all the time, because while they might, in theory, work in harmony, these formulas, there will be years in practice where they do not work in harmony.
And Ms. Bosler or Mr. Schweitzer, do you want to respond to that? Or how you have imagined this could be a possibility and what your response is?
So, I mean, I think that Mr. Cisney makes a very good point, that the overlay of complex formulas, is difficult to predict, and we can't know all of the outcomes and all the machinations that may happen. With regards to the current year in the Test 3, that may be the situation, but I think it's important to understand the true-up mechanism, because the true-up mechanism is not a simple withdrawal or suspend or in and out of the reserve. It's really a re-estimating of the amount that should be on deposit in the reserve. So, I mean, there are a lot of numbers changing when we go back and true up the reserve and also the 98 guarantee. So, and I think it's really important to understand under our proposal that monies would not be going into the 98 reserve if there was not enough money flowing to schools for growth in COLA. And so I think that certainty is something that we just don't have now. And so I think that's something that is why we're really even contemplating this reserve requirement.
And this would be a question for each of you. Given the complexities and challenges of the fact and need of the true-up as a result of our lack of specific information relative to capital gains as we pass our budget, would it be a little more direct and a little bit simpler if we were to, rather than use those capital gains above 6.5%, anything that's beyond revenue beyond projection, or as you've talked about before, Mr. Cisney, the April surprise, that we would use those dollars, since we didn't count on them, we didn't balance our budget on them, nothing's programmatically dependent upon them, put those dollars, we know what they are, into a reserve.
That's certainly another option. I think, there are many kind of lines in the sand that can be drawn related to how much money should be going into the reserve. We chose one that was capital gains. It's easy to understand. It's something that we know is volatile, and so that was really, I think, our reasoning behind choosing that. Certainly there are other things that you can choose, an April surprise. That would essentially be very much the devil's in the details about exactly what is unanticipated and what was already projected. I think those kinds of things, which is really a lot of the complexity of ACA 4, is trying to make this determination about what is unanticipated. And I think you would have probably some of the same challenges with determining an April surprise. But I'm willing to listen to, what those alternatives could be.
Thank you for that.
I think we've discussed April surprise mechanisms in the past. I think we're less confident in them now than we have been previously, in part because we now have more of our revenue coming in June than we did before. That's after April. So when you pass the budget, you don't know what that's going to be. And also under our accrual mechanism, what happens is in part dependent on the calculations that are made over the next year or two. So the revenue system that we have today, it's not as compatible as it used to be with an April surprise mechanism. And some of that is resultant to Prop 30? Some of it. And Prop 30 probably is another factor that makes an April surprise mechanism a little bit more difficult to implement, because Prop 30, to a large degree, is taxing capital gains, and we really don't have a good sense of what that is, how it affects accruals, for instance, until a year or two later.
Colleagues, yes, Senator Ross, Senator Hancock.
This Prop 98 reserve holds a fascination for me, so I apologize for asking another question. LAO, in looking at your PowerPoint presentation or the slides, you talk about the fact that if I'm reading this, the reserve sets aside a portion of required school spending in strong capital gains years. Page, covered up my page, but strong capital gains years to give to schools later during weak years, page 4. So in other words, we're taking money that would otherwise flow to the schools as a result of the guarantee in a strong year, and we're diverting it into this 98 reserve. Am I understanding it correctly?
I think so, yes.
So I'm curious, so the decision to withdraw from this reserve, is that Is that made on a district-by-district basis in any given year, depending on local factors?
As we understand the administration's proposal, it really would be a statewide count. So it would sort of go into the Prop 98 pot, which is distributed according to statute in the annual budget process.
So in a weak year, given the fact, and I'm going to reveal my fundamental misunderstanding of this whole process right now, but it is what it is, right? So in a weak year, given the Prop 98 guarantee, which means there you have a formula and you calculate how much money is guaranteed to schools and districts, right? Is this reserve fund, in a sense, being set up to prop up the non-98 side of the budget?
No, the answer is no. The Prop 98 reserve is separate and apart from the regular reserve, cannot be used for non-98 purposes. The purpose of it is to set some of those spike revenues, those very anomaly revenues, to hold them back during times of plenty, when there's enough money to make sure that their growth and COLA are fully funded, and then have them available for when revenues then go the other direction and dive down, where we're in a situation where the minimum guarantee is in decline. And we want to be able to then allocate those revenues out during those decline years so to mitigate some of the impacts of the up and down that the 98 guarantee is also subject to, along with our revenues.
Oh, I see. So in a weak year, the Prop 98 guarantee based on state revenue declines, but the guarantee is what it is. And the concept is that the 98 reserve fund would then supplement the guaranteed money to school districts during the weak years and give them more than what the 98 guarantee would otherwise require in that particular weak revenue year.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
I think going to it, I don't think, as you state, I don't think that's the administration's intent. When the language becomes available, I think everyone will want to examine it and think about how it could work. Proposition 98, as many of you know, is a living, breathing mechanism. It requires a lot of judgment in the budget process each year. And so, again, while I don't think it's the intent of the administration to have it work that way, would it work differently in practice? I think that's something that you'll want to think about as you look at the language and go through the process.
Well, perhaps, I mean, I don't sit on that budget subcommittee, but I might attend. Perhaps when this is considered by the budget subcommittee, if it is, someone could come in with some concrete examples to demonstrate with facts and figures how this is going to work in a strong year and in a weak year, so those of us who are mentally challenged can grasp this concept. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Roth.
And I wish I had brought some of my charts, but this is the chart from the first chapter of the budget that is the 98 guarantee. And you can see it's not been a smooth line that goes going upwards. It's been up and down. And I think the intent is really to help smooth the line. So schools, especially between the 2007-8 and 8-9 year, where they went from $56.6 billion to $49.2 billion, we would want to be in a position to be able to mitigate that if the revenues ever do swing again like they did that year.
Focusing solely on the 98.
On the 98.
Thank you.
Senator Hancock.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very in sympathy with the idea of the reserve and the stabilization, most particularly, and to me it becomes a little bit like an automatic withdrawal from your paycheck for your savings account or something that we try to do. I'm wondering why strong, specific goals set in statute wouldn't be a way to think about this instead of a constitutional amendment based on complex formulas like the LAO suggested. But I'm doing that because I'm thinking about the timing and the need to be flexible and nimble, which is one of the things government often isn't, particularly as it would relate to the opportunity costs, or I would say the economic opportunity costs that Senator Leno alluded to in his first question. In other words, 4 years from now, you've lost a high school generation. We've been told that one of the reasons California has such a high poverty rate, basically from university researchers, that it's housing and the lack of higher education for so many Californians. So you've lost an economic engine for a period of time. The judicial branch was mentioned. I've been thinking about job creation. We right now have a very weak recovery. We just read the articles about Walmart's stock going down because people don't have enough money to be consumers anymore. The governors often talked about pay-as-you-go instead of bonding, which makes a lot of financial sense if we can do it. We have decaying infrastructure. Have we looked at what we would try to do to get a stronger recovery so that we wouldn't need the reserves in the future? So that's a question. And then connected with that is, why don't we also account for growth and COLA in the other government functions? I understand why we want to do it in education, but why not in infrastructure repair, the judiciary, health care, that kind of thing?